The day we buried Grandpa Harold, rain covered the cemetery in a cold gray silence. Everyone stood beneath black umbrellas pretending to mourn, but I noticed something strange about my parents. While relatives wiped tears from their eyes, my mother kept glancing at her phone, whispering to my father whenever she thought nobody was watching. Even at the funeral, they seemed distracted or impatient. Grandpa had been gone less than 3 hours before my father finally muttered the words that made my stomach turn. "We need to discuss the property. The property, not Grandpa's home, not Grandma Eleanor's house, not the place where our family spent every Christmas for 30 years. Just property." Grandma heard him too. I saw the sadness flicker behind her tired eyes, though she quickly hid it behind a gentle smile. At 78 years old, she looked smaller than I remembered, wrapped in Grandpa's oversized gray coat as if she still needed his warmth beside her. "I think your father deserves one quiet evening before we start discussing business," she said softly. Dad forced a fake smile. "Of course, Mom, we're only trying to help." I had heard that tone before. It was the same voice he used whenever he wanted something. The next morning, I drove back to Grandma's house to check on her. The old Victorian home stood at the end of Maple Street, exactly as it always had, white wooden walls, ivy climbing across the porch, wind chimes ringing gently in the morning air. Grandpa had built half the furniture inside with his own hands. Every inch of the house carried memories. But when I walked inside, tension already filled the rooms. Mom stood in the kitchen flipping through paperwork while Dad spoke on the phone in a low voice. "Yes," he whispered, "the land alone is worth a fortune." The moment he noticed me, he quickly ended the call. "Oh good, you're here," Mom said brightly. "We're helping Grandma organize things." Grandma sat quietly at the dining table holding a cup of untouched tea. She looked exhausted. "What kind of paperwork?" I asked carefully. Dad shrugged. "Just estate matters." Something felt wrong immediately. Over the next few days, my parents practically moved into the house. Mom began placing colored stickers on furniture, labeling what should be donated or stored. Dad invited strangers over who walked around measuring walls and examining the property line, real estate agents. One evening I found Grandma alone in the backyard garden, trimming dead roses while the sunset painted the sky orange. "Do you know they're trying to sell the house?" I asked quietly. She continued clipping branches calmly. "I assumed they would." "You assumed?" I stared at her. "Grandma, they're making plans without even asking you." She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Money changes people, sweetheart." I waited for anger or heartbreak, but she simply returned to her roses as if she'd expected this moment for years. That night, everything became worse. I walked downstairs for water around midnight and heard my parents talking in the kitchen. "She doesn't need this much space anymore," Mom whispered. Dad laughed quietly. "Once we sell it, we can finally breathe again." The developer already offered nearly $2 million. $2 million. My chest tightened. "And what about Grandma?" Mom asked. "We'll move her into one of those senior apartments. She'll complain for a while, then adjust." I felt sick listening to them discuss her life like moving old furniture into storage. Then Dad said something that chilled me completely. "She probably won't live long enough to notice the difference anyway." I nearly walked into the kitchen right then, but Grandma's voice stopped me. Late-night conversations rarely sound honorable through thin walls. My parents froze. Grandma stood quietly in the hallway, wearing her pale blue robe, her silver hair resting loosely on her shoulders. She didn't look angry. She looked disappointed. Mom immediately switched to fake concern. "We were only trying to help you, Eleanor." Grandma nodded slowly. "Of course you were." Dad forced an awkward laugh. "You know how stressful things have been financially." Grandma stared at him for several long seconds before speaking. "Greed usually sounds reasonable to the greedy." The room fell silent. For a moment, I thought she might finally confront them directly. Instead, she simply turned and walked back upstairs without another word. Dad exhaled heavily once she disappeared. "She's becoming confused," he muttered, but I knew better. Grandma wasn't confused at all. In fact, as I helped her upstairs later that night. She squeezed my hand gently and whispered something that kept me awake until morning. Your grandfather prepared for this long ago. Then she smiled, not sadly, knowingly. The week after Grandpa's funeral, my parents acted like the house already belonged to them. Dad walked through every room talking loudly about renovation value and developer interest. Mom spent hours online looking at luxury condos in Florida, pretending she was simply dreaming. Meanwhile, Grandma Elinor quietly continued her daily routines, as if nothing around her had changed. Every morning, she watered the roses. Every afternoon, she sat on the porch swing Grandpa built decades ago. And every evening, she smiled politely while my parents slowly dismantled her life around her. Their greed became impossible to hide. One afternoon, I arrived to find Mom wrapping Grandma's antique dishes in newspaper. "What are you doing?" I asked sharply. She barely looked up. "Packing Earlie saves time." "Packing for what?" Mom sighed dramatically. "Your grandmother can't manage this huge house alone anymore. We found a lovely retirement apartment closer to medical facilities." Grandma entered the kitchen at that exact moment carrying fresh tea. "I never agreed to move," she said calmly. Mom forced an uncomfortable laugh. "Oh, Elinor, we're just preparing options." But the truth was obvious. They had already made the decision for her. That night I sat beside Grandma in the living room, while an old jazz record played softly in the background. Grandpa's favorite chair still sat near the fireplace untouched, his reading glasses resting on the side table, exactly where he'd left them. "You need to stop them," I whispered. Grandma surprised me by smiling. "Why?" "Because they're taking advantage of you." She looked toward the staircase where my parents were arguing upstairs about money. "Sometimes," she said softly, "people need the freedom to reveal who they truly are." Her calmness frustrated me. I couldn't understand why she wasn't fighting back. Then, 3 days later, the answer finally arrived. A black luxury car pulled into the driveway just before noon. Dad nearly ran outside to greet the visitors. 2 men in expensive suits stepped out, followed by a younger woman carrying a leather folder. The developers. Mom quickly adjusted her necklace and whispered excitedly to Dad, "This is finally happening." Grandma remained seated quietly near the window, knitting a scarf, as if strangers weren't about to discuss selling her entire life. Dad clapped his hands together nervously. "Let's all sit down and make this official." The men introduced themselves politely and complimented the property. They talked about modern apartments, commercial buildings, and future profits. Listening to them describe Grandpa's home like empty land made my stomach twist. One of the developers finally opened the folder. "We've prepared the purchase agreement," he announced. "Once Mrs. Elinor signs, we can release the first payment immediately." Dad smiled so widely I thought his face might crack. Mom looked ready to celebrate already, but Grandma slowly placed her knitting needles down. "I won't be signing anything," she said. The room went silent. Dad's smile disappeared instantly. "Mom, we discussed this." "No," Grandma replied calmly. "You discussed it." Dad's voice hardened. "The paperwork is already prepared." "Yes," Grandma said. "And that's the interesting part." She turned toward the young woman holding the folder. "Would you mind checking the ownership documents again carefully?" Confused, the woman opened the file and began flipping through pages. At first, her expression remained neutral. Then suddenly she frowned. She checked the documents again and again. Finally, she looked up slowly. "There's a problem." Dad blinked. "What problem?" The woman cleared her throat nervously. "Mrs. Elinor no longer solely owns this property." My father's face turned pale. "What are you talking about?" Before she could answer, another voice spoke from the doorway. "Allow me." An older man entered carrying a briefcase. Grandma smiled warmly the moment she saw him. "Good afternoon, Walter." Dad stared in confusion. "Who is this?" The man adjusted his glasses calmly. "Walter Bennett, your parents' attorney for the past 22 years. The room suddenly felt smaller. Walter placed several documents on the table. "Approximately 8 months ago," he explained, Harold and Eleanor transferred ownership of this property into a protected family trust. Mom looked horrified. A trust, Walter nodded. The house cannot legally be sold unless all named beneficiaries approve the transaction. Dad grabbed the papers violently. Who are the beneficiaries? Walter looked directly at me. You are one of them. I froze. Grandma smiled gently at my shocked expression. Several local charities were also listed, along with preservation conditions preventing commercial demolition of the property. Dad's hands shook with rage. You tricked us. Grandma's face remained calm, but her eyes turned cold for the first time. No, she said quietly. I protected your father's home from people who saw it as a payday. Mom suddenly burst into tears. We were only trying to help you. Grandma stared at her sadly. If that were true, she whispered, you would have asked what I wanted. Then Walter delivered the final blow. There is another issue, he said carefully. Since advance funds were already accepted during an unauthorized sale negotiation, the developer may pursue legal action. The developer's expression darkened immediately. Dad looked like the floor had vanished beneath him. And through all the chaos, Grandma simply picked up her knitting needles again, like she'd known this moment was coming all along. The silence after Walter's announcement felt heavier than thunder. Nobody moved for several seconds. My father stood frozen beside the dining table, gripping the papers so tightly they crumpled in his fists. My mother's mascaras, streaked tears no longer looked convincing now that panic had replaced performance. The developers exchanged cold glances. One of them finally spoke. Mr. Carter, are you telling us you negotiated a multi-million-dollar sale for property you didn't legally control? Dad immediately pointed toward Grandma. She changed everything behind our backs. Walter calmly adjusted his glasses. Actually, the trust was finalized 8 months ago with complete legal documentation. Mom's voice cracked. You planned this? Grandma looked at her quietly. No. Your father and I prepared for reality. The younger developer closed the folder sharply. We'll be contacting our legal department. Dad followed them outside desperately, trying to explain, but the moment the black luxury car disappeared down Maple Street, the confidence he'd carried for weeks vanished with it. For the first time in my life, my father looked small. That evening, the house felt strangely peaceful, despite the disaster unfolding around us. Grandma sat near the fireplace knitting, while soft rain tapped against the windows. Meanwhile, upstairs, my parents argued loudly enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. You told me the house was hers, Mom shouted. Dad snapped back. How was I supposed to know Dad changed the ownership? You spent the advance payment already. You spent half of it too. Their voices grew uglier with every accusation. I glanced toward Grandma awkwardly. Do you want me to tell them to stop? She slowly shook her head. When people are drowning, she said softly, they usually reveal exactly who they are. The next few days became chaos. Phone calls started arriving early every morning. Lawyers, developers, banks, debt collectors. Dad spent hours locked in the guest room trying to negotiate repayment deadlines. Mom stopped pretending to care about Grandma and instead focused entirely on saving herself. One afternoon, I overheard her whispering furiously on the phone. No, we don't have the money anymore because the sale collapsed. By the end of the week, reality hit hard. The developer formally accused my parents of fraudulent negotiation practices. Since they had already accepted and partially spent advance funds from the deal, they were now personally responsible for repayment. And they didn't have the money. Luxury dreams disappeared overnight. The Florida condo plans vanished. The new car orders were cancelled. And suddenly, Mom began selling jewelry online, while Dad avoided answering unknown numbers. But the worst part wasn't the financial collapse. It was how quickly everyone around them lost respect. Relatives who once praised my parents suddenly stopped calling. Dad's business partners distanced themselves quietly. Friends disappeared the moment money and scandal entered the conversation. Greed had finally exposed them. Yet through everything, Grandma remained calm. Every morning she still watered her roses. Every afternoon she baked bread or read near the window. And every evening she asked me to help restore old furniture in Grandpa's garage workshop, you know. She told me while sanding one of Grandpa's handmade chairs, "Your grandfather loved fixing broken things." I smiled faintly. Even people, she paused for a moment, especially people. Working beside her slowly healed something inside me. For years I'd kept my distance from the family because of my parents' selfishness. But inside Grandpa's old workshop, surrounded by the scent of cedar wood and machine oil, I finally felt connected to home again. Then came the night everything exploded. Dad stormed downstairs holding several unopened bills. "This is your fault," he yelled at Grandma. "You humiliated us." Grandma calmly folded her hands in her lap. "No, your choices humiliated you." Mom entered behind him crying again, though this time the fear seemed real. "We're drowning financially," she whispered. "Please just help us." For a brief moment I almost felt sorry for them. But Grandma asked one simple question. "When was the last time either of you visited this house before learning its value?" Silence filled the room. Mom looked down. Dad clenched his jaw. Neither answered, because we all knew the truth. Before Grandpa died, months could pass without my parents visiting. Holidays felt rushed, phone calls were rare, but the moment they smelled money, they suddenly became devoted children again. Grandma stood slowly and walked toward the staircase. "I won't rescue you from greed," she said quietly. "But I also won't destroy you." Dad frowned in confusion. She turned back toward them. "Sell your expensive cars, stop pretending you're wealthy, get honest jobs if necessary, start over like ordinary people." Dad's face twisted with anger. "You're choosing strangers over your own family." Grandma's eyes filled with heartbreak instead of rage. "No," she whispered, "I'm choosing dignity over greed." Dad slammed the front door so hard the windows rattled. Mom followed behind him sobbing. After they left, Grandma lowered herself carefully into Grandpa's old chair, suddenly looking far older than before. "Does revenge always feel this sad?" I asked quietly. She stared at the empty doorway for a long time. "This isn't revenge," she finally said. "It's consequence." Then her expression darkened slightly. "And I'm afraid your father's problems are only beginning." The next morning, 2 investigators arrived asking questions about several of Dad's previous property deals. And suddenly, Grandma's house was no longer the biggest secret threatening to destroy my parents' lives. By the time autumn arrived, my parents' lives had completely unraveled. The investigation into my father's business dealings spread far beyond Grandma's house. More complaints surfaced from former clients and investors. Several property contracts had been manipulated, payments had mysteriously disappeared, and promises had been broken long before the failed sale of Grandpa's home. For years, Dad had hidden behind confidence and charm. Now everyone finally saw the truth. News traveled quickly through our town. People who once shook my father's hand with admiration suddenly crossed the street to avoid him. My mother stopped attending social events after whispers followed her everywhere she went. The image they spent decades building collapsed in only a few months. Yet inside Grandma Elinor's home, something entirely different was happening. Life was returning. The house no longer felt tense or heavy with greed. Instead, it slowly became warm again, filled with purpose instead of arguments. Grandma decided to honor Grandpa Harold in the way he would have loved most, by helping others. Together, we transformed the downstairs rooms into a small community space. The dining room became a place where struggling families could share free meals. Grandpa's workshop turned into a classroom where teenagers learned woodworking and repairs. And the guest rooms were prepared for women and children needing temporary shelter. The same house my parents tried to sell for profit became a place of safety. People from all over town began visiting. Some brought donations, others volunteered their time. Old neighbors shared stories about Grandpa fixing broken fences for free or helping families during difficult winters. I realized then something my parents never understood. Grandpa's real wealth had never been money. It was the life he built around kindness. One cold evening, Grandma and I sat together on the porch swing, wrapped in blankets, while leaves drifted across the yard. "Do you miss him every day?" I asked softly. She smiled sadly. "Every single day." Then she squeezed my hand gently. "But loving someone means continuing the good they left behind." For the first time since Grandpa died, the pain in her voice carried peace instead of emptiness. A week later, something unexpected happened. My parents came back, not in expensive clothes, not in luxury cars, not acting superior. They looked exhausted. Dad's hair had turned noticeably grayer, and Mom's face no longer carried the polished confidence she once wore like armor. They stood nervously at the front door, holding grocery bags as if unsure whether they were welcome. "I made soup," Mom said quietly. Grandma looked surprised but stepped aside to let them in. Dinner that night felt painfully awkward at first. Nobody knew what to say. The silence stretched between us like broken glass. Then Dad finally spoke. "I lost everything." There was no arrogance left in his voice, no excuses either. He explained that investigators had uncovered years of dishonest business practices. His reputation was ruined, his partnerships destroyed, and most of their savings gone. They had sold nearly everything to avoid bankruptcy. Mom quietly wiped tears from her eyes. "We spent so many years chasing money," she whispered, "and somehow we became people I don't even recognize anymore." Grandma listened without interrupting. When they finished speaking, she stood slowly and disappeared upstairs for several minutes before returning with 2 sealed envelopes. She handed one to each of them. Dad frowned. "What's this?" "A beginning," Grandma replied. Inside each envelope was a modest financial check, not enough to erase their mistakes, but enough to rent a small apartment and rebuild their lives honestly. Mom looked stunned. "After everything we did, why would you help us?" Grandma's answer filled the room with silence. "Because punishment teaches fear," she said softly, "but consequences are supposed to teach wisdom." Dad lowered his eyes in shame. Then Grandma revealed the truth I would never forget. "Your father planned the trust carefully before he died," she explained. "Not because he hated you, but because he saw what greed was turning this family into." She looked around the old dining room gently. "He believed the only way to save this family was to let the truth reveal itself, and it had." My parents finally cried honestly that night, not fake tears for sympathy, but real grief for the people they had become. Whether they fully changed afterward, I can't say, but they never chased wealth the same way again. Years later, when Grandma peacefully passed away in her favorite chair beside the garden window, the house remained exactly where Grandpa wanted it to be. Not demolished, not sold, not forgotten. It became a permanent community home, carrying both their names above the front porch. Sometimes people think revenge means destruction, but Grandpa and Grandma taught me something far more powerful. The sweetest revenge is building something good that greed can never destroy.